when the wind finally rested. The wind had been relentless that week. It tore through streets and alleys with impatient force, bending branches into sharp angles, tossing paper along sidewalks, and tugging at loose clothing as though testing the patience of everyone it passed. Windows rattled, and the smell of rain carried over rooftops, mixing with dust and the faint scent of burnt leaves from somewhere beyond sight. She walked slowly along the edge of the harbor, her coat pulled tight around her, shoes sinking slightly into the damp sand where tidewater had reached before receding. She could hear the wind in its many forms, a low sigh along the wooden pilings, a harsh rasp against metal railings, the soft hiss of water moving over stones. It was impossible to ignore, yet it was impossible to confront directly, too. One could only move alongside it, letting it shape the body and mind as much as the landscape itself. The harbor had always been her refuge. Even now, battered by wind and rain, it offered a kind of clarity she did not find elsewhere. The boats bobbed gently, tied securely to weathered posts, their hulls creaking with every tug of current and gust. The nets left draped across the docks shifted like sleeping creatures, catching fragments of wind and light in their folds. There was a rhythm here, she realized, an invisible pulse that mirrored the beating of her own heart in moments when the world seemed too loud, too fast, too disordered. For days, she had watched the wind unrelenting, testing structures, trees, and the patience of people. The weather reports had warned of gusts, of branches breaking, of fallen wires, yet here she was, drawn by a curiosity she could not explain. It was not recklessness, she was careful, but there was a fascination in the way the wind revealed the unseen fragility of everything it touched. And perhaps, in some way, it reminded her of herself, resilient, yet not impervious, vulnerable, yet still moving forward. She paused at the edge of the pier, leaning lightly against a railing slick with rain. From this vantage point, the horizon seemed endless, a muted line where gray sky met gray water. She thought of the days ahead, of the work and obligations that waited like shadows beyond the harbor. But here, she could allow herself to simply exist. The wind carried nothing but the immediate, water, air, and the faint cries of gulls circling overhead. The past and future felt distant, irrelevant in this small, suspended moment. A sudden shift in the wind brought a new sound, a small clatter behind her, metal against stone, perhaps a lid from a crate or a lost tool from a nearby boat. She turned, expecting to see someone rushing in the gusts, but found only an empty dock. The sound repeated, faintly, like a heartbeat she could just perceive. She smiled, almost imperceptibly, at the way the world persisted in its own rhythm, independent of desire or expectation. It was late afternoon when the first hints of calm appeared. The wind began to soften, its urgency fading into something more patient, more deliberate. The air, once sharp against her skin, grew warmer, carrying a scent of distant soil and wet reeds. The boats, which had tossed with near violence, drifted more evenly, their ropes humming a low, steady tone rather than straining against abrupt motion. The clouds shifted, light piercing through in patches, painting the harbor in soft, scattered gold. She continued along the pier, allowing herself to notice the small changes, the way water rippled differently against the dock, the subtle reflection of light in each wave, the faint movements of insects that dared emerge in the softened air. She realized that the wind had shaped everything, not destroyed, not broken, but carved space for observation, for noticing what might otherwise have been overlooked. She paused near a cluster of wooden posts, their surfaces scarred from countless storms. In the gap between them, she spotted a small piece of debris, a tattered fragment of cloth, frayed at the edges, clinging stubbornly to a nail. Its color was faded, muted in the waning light. She picked it up, running her fingers along the threads, thinking of how such a small object could endure, could persist, could continue to exist despite the force of the wind and the wear of time. It struck her as a quiet metaphor, one she did not need to name or fully articulate. Later, she found herself at the far end of the harbor, where the water pooled in shallow indentations between rocks. She knelt and let her hands hover over the surface, feeling the chill of the water, the small resistance of the current. The wind had left faint ripples, patterns that would soon vanish entirely. She traced them with her fingers, following their brief arcs, and realized that beauty often existed only in the temporary, in the way patterns formed and dissipated, visible only to those who paused long enough to see them. She rose, brushing wet sand from her coat, and walked back toward the pier. The calm was nearly complete, the harbor breathing in a slower, steadier rhythm. She could hear distant laughter, muted and soft, as people began to emerge from sheltered streets, noticing the change in the air. She felt herself blending into this slower tempo, her own movements less urgent, her mind less preoccupied with planning or worry. And then she saw him. He was leaning against a railing, hands in pockets, hair damp and sticking slightly to his forehead. For a brief moment, she thought she had imagined him, a figure from her past, a presence she had not expected to find here. But he was real, walking slowly along the docks, observing, adjusting his pace with the softening wind. He did not see her. He did not acknowledge her presence, yet there was something profoundly familiar in the way he moved, the tilt of his shoulders, the quiet patience in his gaze. She watched him for a while, careful not to intrude, noticing the subtle ways he engaged with the world, the shift of his weight, the way his hands brushed against surfaces, the careful attention to every small detail. She felt a strange sense of closure, though there had been no confrontation, no dialogue, no recognition. The presence alone, fleeting, accidental, silent, allowed a space for reflection she had not known she needed. The wind continued to settle, and the harbor, the water, the clouds, and even the distant cityscape seemed to exhale. She walked closer to the edge of the pier, letting her coat flap gently, feeling the stillness where moments before there had been turbulence. The objects she passed, crates, ropes, buoys, all seemed imbued with a new kind of resonance, a quiet endurance shaped by the storm, not diminished by it. She thought about the wind, how it had demanded attention, how it had carved time and space for noticing. It had forced her to slow, to observe, to recognize impermanence, and to embrace the subtle persistence of existence. She thought of herself in relation to it, capable of enduring, capable of noticing, capable of finding peace in the intervals between force and calm. By evening, the harbor was nearly still. Reflections shimmered on the water, faint and wavering, catching the soft glow of streetlights just beginning to flicker on. She lingered at the edge, taking in the expanse, the gradual settling of movement, the quiet geometry of light and shadow. She thought about the man she had observed, about the shapes of her own memories, about the patterns the wind had drawn in her perception, invisible but indelible. When she finally turned to leave, the wind had not vanished entirely, but it had become a companion rather than an adversary. She walked slowly along the path back, feeling the air settle around her, carrying with it the residue of rain, salt, and quiet reflection. In her mind, she traced the contours of the day, of the storm, of her own movements, and understood, not with clarity but with an instinctive sense, that resilience is not demonstrated in opposition to the world, but in the patient observation of its rhythms, in the ability to persist, and in the quiet acknowledgement of what is temporary and what endures. She paused once more, looking back at the harbor. The water was calm, boats swaying gently, light reflected in gentle arcs across the surface. She allowed herself a small, private smile, not for triumph, not for completion, but for presence. The wind had rested, yes, but it had left behind traces, lessons written not in words, but in the careful motion of things, in the spaces between movements, in the quiet persistence of the world. And she understood, finally, that rest was not the end, but a necessary pause in the ongoing rhythm of life, a chance to observe, to attend, and to carry forward the subtle awareness that even the most relentless force eventually leaves space for stillness. She walked home slowly, each step deliberate, listening to the echo of her own rhythm as it blended with the settling of the world. The storm had passed. The wind had rested. And in that pause, she carried forward a quiet knowledge that life's most enduring truths often arrive not in the grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the small, observed intervals where presence itself becomes both witness and understanding.